Hello, everybody, and welcome to the University of Galway's Ryan Institute and Master's Program on Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security COP27 briefings for 2022. I'm delighted that everybody could join us today, and we look forward to an informative briefing from our students who are on the Master's Program on Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security. My name is Professor Charlie Spillane. I'm the director of the Ryan Institute here at the university. We're a broad research institute that spans the entire university, focused on sustainability. And central to that sustainability mission, the climate crisis is critical to the research and innovation and education activities that we try to do at the university to make our contribution. And in that context, we established back in 2014 a master's program on climate change, agriculture and food security in partnership with partners such as the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research and also various UN agencies. And in that period of time, we've graduated over 200 MScCCAFS students that have gone on to continue to make contributions in relation to ameliorating the climate crisis that is facing humanity today. So it's 2022, it's 20 years since the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was open for signature at the Rio Convention at the Rio Earth Summit Convention. And in that period of time, there have been negotiations underway between the member states of the United Nations to agree on approaches to reduce emissions, but also to build resilience and in relation to climate change adaptation. And here we are in 2022, and the situation is that emissions continue to rise. There are a number of increasingly alarming reports from the World Meteorological Organization, from the IPCC, we have them from the UNEP Emissions Gap Report, the International Energy Agency, World Resources Institute, and others. And really what these are pointing towards is that despite all of the attention that is being placed on climate change, and we're all aware that climate change is happening, the behavior of our societies and economies is such that emissions keep rising, and the prospects of keeping planetary warming within 1.5 degrees are increasingly becoming out of reach. So it's against that backdrop that the COP27 negotiations begin next Sunday in Egypt and Sharm El-Sheikh, where the world's leaders and governments will meet to continue the negotiations to try and accelerate climate action. And as our contribution to that process, we have asked this year and last year our climate change, agriculture and food security students to provide briefings on what are the key topics and issues arising and that will be negotiated over the next 2 weeks at COP27. So our students have been investigating diligently what are the key topics, and they put together a briefing, which I'm going to hand over in a moment to Saoirse and Aoife. And we're going to run 3 briefings this year over the period of COP27. One is this Friday at this time, and then the next one is the same time next Friday, when we can look at what the progress has been over the past week. And then the following one on the following Wednesday to just close to the end of the COP27. And we'll also try and connect from COP27 itself with the students here in Galway to get some commentary as well from the floor at COP27 over the briefings next week and on the following Wednesday. So at that, I'm going to hand over to Aoife and to Saoirse, who on behalf of their group are going to present what they have found out in relation to what are the key and hot topics that are under negotiation and critical topics that are under negotiation next week at COP27.
So thank you, Charles, for that nice introduction. So today, we're going to be doing a briefing on lining up some of the key issues that we see or think will be negotiated at COP27 and the expected outcomes or challenges that might arise from those issues. So go to the next slide, please. This briefing, as Charles mentioned already, was researched and developed by 7 students from the Masters of Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security course here at the University of Galway. So myself, Aoife Roach, and Saoirse will be presenting this to you today. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of history on the COP for those who might not be as aware. So it was set up and kind of began back in 1992 and is an extended meeting, essentially bringing in representatives from governments, scientific and environmental experts, researchers, companies, civil society members, non-governmental organizations, and even activists together in order to cooperate and develop solutions and policies that will deal with the climate crisis. So in the 30 years since the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, the UNFCCC was adopted, there have been 26 such climate summits, and the most recent of which was last year in Galway in 2021. And the next year is expected to be in Dubai in 2023. So a significant step in the COP journey has been the Paris Agreement. This was lauded originally as having huge potential for battling climate change, but recently it's not been as successful as it was hoped to be. And the world is at the moment expected to miss the Paris Agreement's target, which was to prevent the world's average temperature rising 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So for instance, currently the atmospheric levels of the three main greenhouse gases, which is carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, they all reach new record highs in 2021. So this COP ideally should be an opportunity to close the gap between where emissions are heading at the moment and where science indicates they should ideally be. Next slide, please. So last year's, just a little bit about last year's COP. It was themed Keep 1.5 Alive, and essentially resulted in almost all countries agreeing to improve their emissions cutting pledges, known as nationally determined contributions, in time for this year's COP. So this hasn't been successful. Currently, the world is still on a path to overshoot even 2 degrees of warming, with only 24 countries submitting improved nationally determined contributions, which really results in only a removal of 0.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gas emissions, which is less than 1% of projected emissions from 2030. And the world is already 1.2 degrees warmer than pre-industrial times. And in fact, a UN Nations report in late October just mentioned that the world is headed actually for a 2.8 degree rise by the end of the century. And despite an expected downward trend in emissions, we aren't doing so at a fast enough rate. So in COP26, they did develop a number of pledges and programs that they were going to follow. So the Global Methane Abatement Pledge, for instance, was developed to reduce global methane emissions by at least 30% from 2020 levels by 2030. There was also the Deforestation Pledge and the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use, which were commitments to reverse deforestation and improve climate finance through to 2025 to address deforestation in the developing world. And there have also been pledges to stop public financing of unabated oil and gas projects by next year, and shifting public funding for fossil fuels into clean energy. Next slide, please. So just a little recap, discussion about what COP27 is going to look like. So the tagline here is Together for Implementation, and it's supposed to be about moving from negotiations and preparing to implement all the promises and pledges made from previous COPs. So it's also been billed as the African COP because its location is taking place in Sharm El-Sheikh in Egypt, and is also aimed on instigating discussion over the provision of increased financing for the low and middle income countries, such as a lot of them are in Africa, who will be experiencing most of the severe impacts of climate change. So it begins in 2 days' time on Sunday, and the 45,000 participants will hopefully build on the outcomes of COP26 to deliver actions or mechanisms with which we can tackle this climate emergency. So ideally, it should include strengthening 2030 targets, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, building more climate resilience, and deliver on the financial commitments as set out by COP26. And eventually, hopefully, they'll tie into the assessment of the collective progress on climate change, which should occur in 2023. So at the moment, like, it's a vital time for dealing with climate change and the effects that it'll have. And ideally in COP27, there should be a heightened sense of emergency. But we've seen a failure of development or implementation of pledges from previous COPs. So what we did as a group was just question whether national priorities had drifted away from a climate focus. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the political environment around COP27, about collaboration as well. So collaboration being central to the COP, but at the moment, politicians around the world seem to be preoccupied with other more immediate crises, like that with the Ukraine war or the energy crisis. And we ask, have we moved away from the momentum of COP26 as a result of this? And could war conflict at the moment result in the summit failing to achieve its intended targets? We also are going to look at whether we'll see the 1.5 degree milestone passed, and is there anything that could come out of this COP that will help us to bring it back down? Like, when every fraction of a degree matters, is how much can the world do in terms of mitigation and adaptation? We'll also look at whether the targets for loss and damage, as set out by the small island developing states or least developed countries, be realized, and look about whether there's going to be increased accountability for targets and pledges that haven't been met, such as those with climate finance. We expect it to continue negotiations on the Paris rulebook and how to implement and negotiate some points that weren't as well defined after Glasgow. So next slide, please. So now I'm just going to be talking a small bit about the political environment surrounding COP27. So we all know it's quite fraught at the moment, and success at COP27 is strongly contingent on goodwill between all parties. It's expected to be extremely difficult due to the increasingly unstable geopolitical context, and we must kind of track how it develops and see whether fostering goodwill between parties with different agendas is possible. So COP26 took place in a far from stable political environment. And even since then, there's been far more fractures around the world, from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, destabilizing key multilateral platforms, and linked to this would be the fuel crisis, which may provide some opportunity to develop cleaner energy programs, but also could possibly result in worsened emissions. It just depends how things turn out. And the Ugandan Tanzanian pipeline, for instance, as well, is politically fraught and has been a source of controversy. And it's a good example of an issue that surrounds the COP27, with the EU disapproving of the project, while other parties thinking the EU disapproving of this being unfair because developed countries in general have contributed far more to global warming in comparison to developing countries, and it should now be their time to develop, and developing countries shouldn't interfere. So should this topic will be brought up, I'm sure, at COP27, and we'll see whether we can balance climate change with increased development. So now I'm going to pass you on to my colleague, Sharshil, who's going to be talking to you a bit more about the issues that we're going to come across. Next slide, please.
Loss and damage is one of the central topics in this year's COP. It was introduced under the Paris Agreement as a separate article on an additional pillar of climate action. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has warned that even if effective actions to limit global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius were put in place, losses and damages stemming from climate change are not preventable. The issue has been a long-standing concern for most vulnerable countries, in particular small island developing states and less developed countries who have championed it in the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change for many years. Small islands are one of the regions that are already facing disproportionate losses and damages, and where these are particularly high. For small islands like in particular, 1.5 is a critical threshold beyond which they may be unable to adapt to climate change. Extreme weather events have unveiled the following vulnerability of developing nations. For instance, Pakistan floods left 33 million people affected, accounting more than 1,700 people killed. The loss and damage was estimated to be $40 billion. Likewise, in Africa, 19 million people were affected by droughts, leaving more than 4,000 deaths. This was the result of high temperatures, floods, storms, and a consequent famine. It can be expected that the issue of loss and damage will have a high political significance at COP27. This is because countries were not originally scheduled to formally discuss funding arrangements for loss and damage, but the G77 and China, which essentially includes all developing nations, have requested it to be added to the agenda. There's an argument around the moral obligation for the global north to recognize their contribution to climate change and how it has limited the potential for the global south's development. One of the main reasons that developed countries' parties have been reluctant to agree on a funding mechanism for loss and damage is the concern that provision of compensation could be construed as an acceptance of liability for climate change-related damages. Next slide, please. Moving on to climate finance, this is expected to be a big topic in COP27, covering the provision of finance from Annex 1 countries to non-Annex 1 ones in order to achieve their climate change goals. In 2009, at COP15, developed countries pledged to provide $100 billion in climate finance annually from 2020. However, this was never fulfilled and was a great source of contention at COP26 last year. The OECD forecasted that developed countries would be able to provide this funding as soon as 2023. However, many actors have called for a number of revisions to the finance pledges. It is expected that climate finance will be revisited in COP27, especially on the following. The first discussion point is that currently most of the funds from developed countries that they claim climate finance are actually loans, often with a higher than market interest rate or with shorter grace periods. It is estimated that this type of financing accounted is around 71% of the public climate finance provided in 2019, increasing the financial burdens of countries already suffering with the impacts of climate change. Organizations, including Oxfam, has called for these loans not to be counted towards climate finance. The second challenge is that much of the climate finance is being awarded to middle-income countries, and potentially not those who need it more, as the process of acquiring the finances requires a lot of expertise and support. These barriers to access must be removed to achieve equity. Finally, the pledge is quite ambiguous, including how the cost will be divided between countries and how much will be directed towards climate change adaptation over mitigation measures, which are currently receiving more funds. Climate finance is one of the main topics of discussion on the agenda of COP27, and many stakeholders are calling for more clarity and regulation. Next slide, please. Moving on to adaptation, this year's COP will have on the table the aims of the Paris Agreement: enhance an adaptive capacity and resilience, reduce vulnerability with a view to contributing to sustainable development, ensuring an adequate adaptation response towards holding average global warming below 2 degrees Celsius and pursuing efforts to hold it below 1.5 degrees Celsius. To achieve these goals, the agreement requires all parties to develop adaptation planning and implementation. The United Nations Environmental Program report from 2021 identified gaps to implement climate change adaptation as follows: widening adaptation finance gap, limited development of monitoring and evaluation mechanisms, insufficient evidence of accurate linkage between national and subnational planning levels, limited information about future trends in climate change, and gender dimensions of adaptations that are still unclear. At COP26, countries adopted Glasgow Climate Pact, which calls for doubling of finance to support developing countries in adaptation to the impacts of climate change and building resilience. Glasgow also established a work program to define a global goal on adaptation, which will identify collective needs and solutions to the climate crisis already affecting many countries. At COP27, we will follow up on these issues. Next slide, please. Climate mitigation is expected to be a large topic at COP27. Countries are expected to demonstrate how they plan to implement the Glasgow Pact, review their climate plans, and create a work program related to mitigation. Climate change mitigation refers to efforts to reduce or prevent the emission of greenhouse gases using new technologies and renewable energy sources, making older equipment more energy efficient, or changing management practices or consumer behavior. This means presenting more ambitious 2030 emissions targets, since UN climate change has said that current plans are still not enough to avoid catastrophic warming. It is a challenge to navigate a coherent path with a compromise to reduce fallout. However, the energy crisis has led to a potential spend of more than $48 billion this winter on new or expanded fossil fuel infrastructure and supplies. COP27 will be hosting discussions to tackle these major challenges. Next slide, please. Transition towards a net zero is crucial to keep global warming levels at 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial figures. Following the Paris Agreement, emissions should be cut by 45% by 2030 and get to net zero by 2050. Samuel Steele, Executive Secretary of UN Climate Change, clarified in October that nations have made some progress this year towards 2030 reduction goal. At present, over 70 countries, including the United States, China, and the European Union, have a net zero target in place. Also, the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change launched in June 2020 a global campaign called Race to Zero, which encompasses cities, regions, businesses, universities, and investors, between others, that have pledged to reach the net zero emissions by 2050. Yet the journey towards net zero seems arduous, as predictions show an increase of almost 11% in global carbon emissions by 2030. Humanity is facing one of its ever biggest challenges confronting climate change. Net zero carbon emissions are a key to alleviate it. The shift towards effective renewable sources of energy, such as solar or wind, is fundamental and is expected to be on COP27's table. Next slide, please. To summarize, as time is running out and 2030 is just 7 years away, the window of opportunity for preventing climate disaster is fast closing. COP27 may well be one of the last opportunities that governments have to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. We ask now if world leaders recognize this urgency and cooperate in order to safeguard the planet, or will they let politics get in the way? Next slide. Thank you to you all. We go back to you, Professor Spillane.
Thanks, thanks so much, Aoife and Saoirse, and on behalf of all your group. I think like you've done a wonderful job of essentially providing the context in which COP27 will begin, and you've particularly pointed towards the political context. You've used the word polycrises, and there's also this term called permacrisis, that we seem to be in this permanent state of crisis. So I guess the kind of key thing I think that is overarching piece as we move towards COP27 is really this question of how to try and keep 1.5 degrees alive, whether that can be possible, and whether the political leadership and ambition will be displayed by our political leaders at COP27 to accelerate the scale and speed of the transitions of our societies to try and stay within 1.5 degrees. And that requires massive changes both to economies and societies that would be quite difficult for political leaders to deliver without the support of their citizens, essentially. So really it's incumbent, I think, on everybody to encourage our political leaders that they feel they have the room to maneuver to make those changes that are necessary. And in our discussions and with the master's class and so forth, the question comes up: what's the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees? Like, does it matter that much? And really, if anybody is questioning that, they would really point them towards the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their 1.5 degree report, which was tasked with looking at what that difference is. And that difference is quite seismic, because what it means really is that the severity of climate change impacts at 2 degrees will be much, much deeper and intense than it will be at 1.5 degrees. And that intensity will be felt for hundreds of years to come, for multiple generations. So really our political leaders are tasked with addressing the climate crisis for future generations, not only current generations. And that really is a major intergenerational climate justice question, in addition to the loss and damage question, which is also a climate justice question as we enter into COP27. So I think I'm delighted by the group's analysis of are the starting point and the lead up to COP27. So what we're going to do is we're going to do another briefing next Friday, same time. At that point, COP27 will have been in operation for, or the negotiations will have been underway for a week, and we'll provide, the students will provide, another group of the students will provide an update. Some of our faculty, myself and others, will be attending COP27, and we will try and connect as well from there to the student briefings, and also pull in some people from the floor in terms of to try and get a kind of a varied commentary on how the negotiations are going. So we'd really encourage anybody who wants to avail of our briefings to join us again next Friday, and also to encourage anybody else who wants to join us. We'd really like to communicate our briefings to as many people as possible so they're aware, and it's an easy means of being up to speed with what's happening at COP27. So at that, I'd like to thank the wonderful analysis of our group, particularly Aoife and Saoirse for being the spokespersons for their group, and we'll see you all next week. So thank you.